Hey there, it's me again. So as I promised, I am just going to keep marching along with the lists year by year. I think from now on I'm just going to start dipping into some random years from the past 6 decades of the Hot 100. Though upon finishing my best and worst list of 1958, I did realize I was still in the mood for some golden oldies. Hence this video, 1959. I'm not totally sure why this is the case, but in terms of pop music at least, I've come to realize that the final year or two of the decade tends to be a bit more chaotic than the 8 or 9 years that came before it. I mean, we're definitely experiencing that today with the plain absurdity that has been 2019's biggest songs and artists, almost as if the scene as a whole is desperately grasping for any semblance of familiar identity in this truly absurd world we live in. But even as we look into the past, the final years of past decades in music history have traditionally worked as an awkward transitional point into the next. 1969 gave us Woodstock, but also Altamont. 1979 was disco's peak, as well as its oversaturation and eventual overblown backlash. 1989 ended the decade of extravagance and hedonism with a nosedive of bland adult contemporary schlock. 1999 bid adieu to the 20th century with an increased emphasis on young pop stars alongside scrubbed and polished production. And the 2000s, while carrying on a pretty solid hip-hop and R&B base for most of its length, made a sudden move towards overblown electric pop production in its final year. Obviously, 1959 is much earlier than any of these years, and we shouldn't expect it to adhere to these rules quite so strictly. Then again, the year is also marked by the infamous February 3rd plane crash that killed up-and-coming rock stars Ritchie Valens, J.P. Richardson, and Buddy Holly. While I'm not certain it was seen as such at the time, Don McLean may have had a point with dubbing this event as the day the music died in his song American Pie. There is an air of cynicism that comes with this tragedy occurring right at the tail end of the 50s, a decade largely marked by its innocence and youthful energy. I don't want to insinuate that this was some kind of premonition for the social and political circumstances that would mark the 60s, but it is really a bit eerie to observe in hindsight. Hardly any of the music from 1959 is really quite as serious as I've made it sound though. Generally speaking, the year continues the dominance of cutesy teen pop, textured R&B and vocal jazz, harmonic doo-wop, and, to a lesser extent, hard-driven rock and roll. With Elvis drafted to the Army and Pat Boone's singles drying up, there's now more room for young musicians to take a slice of the pop charts, such as Ricky Nelson, Connie Francis, Frankie Avalon, and newcomers like Bobby Darin, Lloyd Price, Jackie Wilson, the Fleetwoods, and many others. I'll talk more about the specific trends of the year once I get to the actual songs. Once again, I expanded my scope this time to include any single that had reached the top 40 within the calendar year of 1959. While the previous year gave me 198 songs to listen to, this year came through with a whopping 284. Spoiler alert, most of these tunes were very middling at best, but of course, there were a lot of notable gems as well. Now I know I had previously done an entire video dedicated to the 10 worst songs of 1958, but I'm going to change it up a bit here. The main reason for that is, truthfully, these songs aren't nearly as interesting to spend so much time on, and to do so would be an exercise in masochism on my part. At the same time though, I know that I myself have a particular fascination for the really bad, poorly aged side of the Hot 100, especially the ones that became genuine hits. And since I know that there are others watching this video right now who have to be just like me in that regard, I'll just rattle through the 10 most notably awful songs that I came across through my dense journey of this really kind of strange year. Mostly I just kind of want to get it over with. So without further ado, these are the worst hit singles of 1959, and here's number 10.
Together now, 1, 2, 3. Keep your mind on your drive and keep your hands on the wheel.
How something so annoying, cutesy, cloying, and perverted made its way into the top 10 of the pop charts is beyond my own explanation. Basically, the protagonist of the song is irked at his friend Fred getting the lovin' of 7 girls somehow all squeezed in the backseat of his car, and tries to get one of them to sit next to him to share some of that lovin'. It's just unsettling in ways that I can't completely explain, and I don't really find the need to do so. I'm sure you'll get the gist just by listening to it.
'Cause you got 4 arms,
The better to hold you,
3 lips.
the better to kiss you.
After the Chipmunk song topped the charts for 4 weeks starting around Christmas 1958, the rest of the year had an obnoxious amount of non-Chipmunk acts using the squeaky voice technology to hopefully nab their own huge hit. None of them worked very well, and few of them were as immensely dreadful as this, a country-esque love song between a man and an extraterrestrial being. It's mildly cute at first, but gets so annoying so quickly. And even among all this, the Chipmunks themselves still produced a couple more hits. Arguably, this might be better than their Christmas song, and it certainly has a stronger melody, yet this is soured by the Chipmunks singing about how they ain't got no type, bad bitches is the only thing that they like.
We sure like girls, all kinds of girls. We like them small or fat or tall.
Moreover, it repeats the whole joke of Alvin ruining the Chipmunks' recording session to Dave's annoyance, which is just pretty dried up at this point. My worst hit single of 1958 was about the love story between an 8-year-old boy and a 1-year-old girl. This song is also a love story and features a boy and a girl who are 5 and 3 years old respectively. Why was this such a trend at the time? And it's made even worse by the main hook of the song being 2 grown men making babbling noises over a limp country rhythm. Ugh. After Mitch Miller and his orchestra achieved a top 20 hit with his recording of A March for the Bridge of the River Kwai, he attempted to strike gold again with yet another march. Unfortunately, the melody he landed on was This Old Man, which results in a far less charming record than the predecessor. The childish choir accompaniment just goes on, with no variation to make this anything but an absolute headache. Even more shocking is that this was only one of 2 versions of this march that charted on the Hot 100 this year. Yeah, next please.
When a girl changes from bobby socks to stockings.
And continuing with the awful trend of sexualizing little girls, here we have Frankie Avalon doing exactly that in his typical nasal delivery. The textured production is lovely indeed, but it's also just a rehash of the much more interesting sound in Avalon's biggest hit, Venus. And no matter what, there are few lines from this year as unsettling as this one.
When a girl changes from bobby socks to stockings, yes, she's old enough to give her heart away.
They say I'm Robin Hood.
So, just take a look at the title and take a look at the lyrics. That's all you need to know for this one.
The boys from Camp Cucamonga, our mother sent us here for to study nature's ways. We learned to make sparks by rubbing sticks together.
At the end of the year, Billboard granted the title of the #1 single of 1959 to The Battle of New Orleans by Johnny Horton. It's not a great song, but its unique subject matter, considering the titular historical battle, set alongside a banjo twang and a march-along, sing-along rhythm, resonated with enough people to top the pop charts for 6 weeks. As expected, the parody of this song is just terrible. It replaces the tension and epic subject matter of the original with the journey for a group of Boy Scouts to catch some Girl Scouts bathing in the nude. It's about as insufferable as you could imagine.
To study nature's ways.
When I hear hang your clothes up, wipe your feet off, goodness sake, don't slam the door, fix the socket, dry.
Not to sound like a broken record from 1958's worst list, but I don't understand these songs that paint marriage as something to avoid at all costs. This falls entirely in line with stereotypes about nagging wives. It is so mean-spirited and pig-headed, I can hardly believe that it resonated with enough people to crack the top 30. Or, yeah, actually I can.
She'll start right in.
I have been on the march for about 6 days. I had neither Bible nor prayer book, but I hope...
This is the only song from this list that I can honestly say that I can make an entire video dissecting what exactly makes it so awful. But I'll save that for another time. Maybe. This is just impressively stale and preachy, sure to bring anyone's pleasant radio listening experience to a crashing halt. I'm not a religious person, so I'm pretty much biased against it from the start. But while I do feel that there are always ways to handle topics like faith with tact and sophistication, this ain't it. Not at all.
I think of the 4 evangelists.
Okay, so that's it with the bad stuff. Now on to the good stuff. These are my top 10 singles of 1959.
Here come the Coasters.
So most of the following songs in this list could best be described as some combination of words like beautiful, innovative, heart-wrenching, erotic, compelling, dreamy, etc. So before we move on to these arguably more mature tunes, I think we should start us off with something just plain adorable.
Now I've got a guy and his name is Dooley. He's my guy and I love him truly.
Now, this is a perfect teen pop tune, if I've ever heard one. After having taken on a singing and dancing career from a very young age, this young performer, born Geraldine Pasquale, was discovered and signed at the age of 12, rechristened with the name Dodie Stevens. Soon thereafter, she recorded and released Pink Shoelaces, a novelty tune about the speaker's boyfriend and his particularly outrageous wardrobe.
He's got 10 shoes with pink shoelaces, a polka-dot vest and that on neck, and a big Panama with a purple hat band.
This whole thing is just so sugary sweet and swings along very pleasantly. It's actually pretty outstanding that Dodie Stevens was 13 years old when she recorded this tune. She gives off the vibe of someone at least 17 or 18. Even if the majority of her lines are spoken, her spunky personality really shines through, and she absolutely dominates this record entirely.
He's got a whirly birdie, 12-foot yacht. Ah, that's not all he's got. He's got
And let me tell you, this is how you do a novelty song. I don't know terribly much about men's fashion of the 50s, but I do know that this era gave way to much more casual wear than had been seen in previous years. Thus, this song could potentially be seen as making fun of youngsters of the day taking on more extravagant fashions to dress a bit more hip than their parents. This is taken to an absurd extreme when the subject of the song is enlisted in the military, and, well...
But he landed in the brig for racing such a storm when they tried to put him in a uniform. He wanted 10 shoes with pink shoelaces.
And as this theme makes its due course, the final verse emphasizes that, yes, every aspect of this man's life is under his own control, in terms of fashion.
Just before the angels come to carry me, I want it down in writing how to bury me.
Well, that's one way to be laid to rest for sure. Okay, yeah, this whole song is absolutely silly. Dodie Stevens would never accomplish a second hit after this one. But honestly, how could you top Pink Shoelaces? It's the 50s teen attitude all wrapped up in one sugary morsel, and succeeds at being one of the finest novelty songs, probably ever. And thank the heavens for that.
Oh, with the purple hat band.
Trapped there in the old sawmill, bed with an evil lad. If you don't give me the deed to your ranch, I'll throw you all in half.
And on that note, it should come as no surprise when I reiterate that the 50s, especially the second half, would come to be known as the decade wherein its pop culture was basically controlled by the teenage demographic. So from there, we'll segue from one slice of the teenage mindset of the day to another. As I mentioned earlier, Ritchie Valens was one of the 3 musicians tragically killed in the infamous plane crash at the start of the year, and the youngest at only 17 years of age. Of the 3 at the time of their deaths, Valens was probably the one most equipped for commercial success. Donna was climbing up the charts at this time and placed at number 3 at the time of the accident. This is not to say that the Big Bopper, or especially Buddy Holly, would also go down as early rock stars with genuine merit. But I also got to admit that Ritchie Valens' Chicano background holds his legacy pretty close to my heart. Like, to know him is to love him. There's very little here in terms of lyrical complexity. But also like the Teddy Bear single, it really is all about the manner in which these distinctly stricken lyrics are presented that make all the difference.
I had a girl, Donna was her name, said she left me, I'd never been the same.
Valens doesn't have too much by way of a masculine chest voice. Even with his more upbeat single La Bamba, the nasal delivery is hard to ignore. Nonetheless, this only makes his performance on Donna all the more vulnerable and heartfelt. Truly distinct from any number of phoned-in performances of the day. The strummed guitars adhere pretty strictly to typical 50s slow progression, but the addition of the soft cymbals and undercurrent of bass further add to the atmosphere of puppy love. This is all led by Valens himself, who once again is just wonderful here. And this all comes to a beautiful peek at the bridge.
Oh, darling, now that you're gone, I don't know what I'll do.
The added element of a life cut unforgivably short makes the entire thing way sadder than I think anyone involved in its recording ever intended it being. Yeah, this is just a beautiful little heartbreak song. It's a bit painful to imagine what else Valens may have done had he lived longer. At the very least, we'll always have this little gem.
Oh, darling, oh, darling.
I mean the cat. Keep on the bus.
I must admit, I don't have a very graceful transition from the artist that we just covered to the song and artist that we're about to cover. So I'll just let it play.
The shark bait has such teeth, dear, and it shows them.
I wrote an actual full-length review on Mac the Knife on my website a couple years ago for a one random single a day challenge I put on for a few months, but I'll also paraphrase what I said in the review in this particular entry. So yes, this song, taken from the 1928 play Die Drei Groschenoper, or The Threepenny Opera, concerns a fictional serial killer, his methods, and his victims. Its main appeal comes with the thick slab of irony with which Darin delivers these lines, namely the light-hearted, almost cheerful descriptions of what are essentially gruesome, untimely murders.
On the sidewalk, ooh, Sunday morning, lies a body just oozing life.
It's both a very uneasy listen, as well as a genuinely entertaining one. Honestly, I would have loved to have been alive and sentient in 1959 to witness the absolute shock that must have gripped the nation when Bobby Darin, of all people, released this song, of all songs. For added context, here are the previous 3 top 10 singles that Darin had released prior to Mac the Knife.
Song about a Saturday night, yeah. The harper will love my queen. Do you know who I mean? I want girl to call my own. I wanna.
Typical teen heartthrob fluff, right? Now, let's make this next single about actual, literal murder.
And Sig loves those where's old Maggie Heath, babe. So there's never a trace of red.
Honestly though, I think it might be because of Darin's traditional pop roots that this works so well. Not necessarily in spite of them. He possesses enough of a biting, youthful personality that the dark comedy of this bombastic tune really reaches its full potential.
There's a tugboat down by the river, don't you know?
Though what really makes this shine brighter than it probably has any right to is that extravagant big band production that undercuts the entire record. Additionally, I'm such a fan of songs that effectively cultivate a naturally progressive tension that just explodes by the end of the track. And this is one of the finer examples of such. Just take a listen to that terrific closure.
Back in town.
Yeah, most will probably declare the song among the upper rungs of the pop hits from this year. While there are a couple other Darin records that I would much sooner choose over this one, there's no denying the biting sardonic energy that is encompassed in all 3 minutes of this glorious bit of morbid jazz. As they say, they just don't make them like this anymore.
Look out, old Maggie is back. Walking down, dropping down, slow walking down.
Okay, now it's time to get weird.
Now it begins. Now that you're gone.
One of my favorite parts about going through the biggest songs of whatever year I happen to be covering is discovering all the weird little gems like these that never find their way on conventional throwback lists or oldies radio or anything. Just the mere sound of this insists that it's a bit too out of the ordinary to simply place next to records by Paul Anka or Lloyd Price without any fuss. The unusual sound in question here is a spooky audio effect known as phasing or flanging, presented throughout the song's duration. Without getting too technical, it involves placing two audio signals together, slightly offset from one another, creating a sonic illusion that resembles a whoosh, as if a jet plane had suddenly entered the recording.
Waiting to hear footsteps that say.
See, that right there is phasing, and here are a few other examples, just for fun.
Inclined to blow my mind, get on the decks with a bed bomb.
Creed, gunpowder, gelatine, dynamite with a laser beam.
What's notable about The Big Hurt is that this is far and away the first major hit song to employ this technique. One might understandably assume that this is more for show than anything else, but the way the entire track is compressed beyond good taste supplies an added dimension of haziness that somehow makes what Tony Fisher is singing all the more distressing.
Watching the clouds till you return, lighting that torch and watching it burn.
The energetic drum pattern sounds bright and happy, but it is pushed all the way back and offset by those tragic strings, as well as Fisher singing. And she is just outstanding here. The production technique makes her sound like some otherworldly creature of sort. But novelty factor aside, it really is her powerful voice that carries this track along so successfully.
I try to pretend it's over at last. This time nothing hurt will end.
The song is an absolute camp classic, from top to bottom. I feel like most folks will be quick to overlook this one, but I honestly love it so much. It's immensely radical in ways that most other artists at the time could only dream of accomplishing. It just checks so many boxes for me, even from the very first listen, and there's no way I wasn't bound to love it as deeply as I do. God, what a record.
Nothing hurt.
Slow talking Joe. A long game, long release, make it down. Commercial game on, so I gotta.
So it's 1959, the 60s are now just over the horizon, and here comes a song that very vividly anticipates what we've got to look forward to.
There go my baby, moving on down the line.
The Drifters were quite an interesting group in their early days. If not for the records, then certainly for the plethora of lineup changes that occurred all throughout their career. It had gotten to the point that by 1959, the group, then renamed the New Drifters, bore entirely no resemblance to the one initially formed 5 years earlier. Fortunately though, this new lineup consisted of new leading man Ben E. King, and let me tell you, this makes all the difference. Benny King has got to have one of the finest voices in the entirety of the R&B and soul genres. And this, the first major hit single under the Drifters' name, certainly showcases this. Every single line he emits absolutely sparkles, and it's not that hard to be convinced of the absolute heartbreak this guy is going through.
Did she really love me? Was she just playing me for a fool?
It's not entirely about Benny King though. This track was one of the many put out by production duo Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller, who had made careers out of writing and producing some of the most influential hits of all time. And let me tell you, this is pretty freaking influential. I know I already gabbed on and on about the production techniques of The Big Hurt, but There Goes My Baby is just as worthy of lengthy praise. Here, Leiber and Stoller make the ambitious decision to place the vocals right at the very front of the track, with layers of instrumentals swimming around in the background. This, of course, anticipates the brill-building sound that would come to dominate the next couple of years in pop music. Those drums are so big and booming, and those violins, those placed in the background, remain absolutely crucial to this tragic love story. The moment at the start where the violins build up and into the track, absolute perfection. Hell, the entire violin track is beautiful on its own. Simply put, this song is exactly the kind of stuff that pop music was made for. What else could you really need?
Now, 1, 2, 3.